Well, welcome, and welcome again. Yes, that's 3 welcomes. That is like a trifecta. It's a Trinitarian welcome. It is the hat tricks of welcome. And so welcome once again to the Everyday Missionary Podcast. And this is episode 286. And today I'm sick. Yeah, you can probably hear it. My voice has been sick for the last couple of days. It just kind of goes with the territory of the winter times. I guess it is, let me see. It is not officially just winter yet, but it will be in a day. So, so anyway, I got something and I'm on the tail end, but it's all up in my head. It's in my throat. It's in my nose. It's just kind of in there. So it gives me a slightly deeper, raspier voice if I really lay into it. And I wish I talked that way all the time, but it's just when I'm sick. It's my little blessing at the time. So anyway, but it is officially the countdown to Christmas for everybody. In our home, it's a little bit different. And so I'm recording this on Wednesday the 20th. Wednesday the 21st will be the Boswell Christmas Eve. Wednesday the 22nd will be our Christmas Day. Since none of these dates really reflect the actual birth of Jesus anyway, then, hey, it's all the more just kind of pick and choose as we go here at this time of year. But that is happening because, yes, I have a wife who is a nurse who will be working her shift on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, so we pushed it up early. And yet with that, I want to just give a big shout out to all of our first responders, to all of our medical staff, to all people who are on call or have to work on the holidays. Thank you for the sacrifice you make. I mean, I think about even the fact of just utility teams. Like in our little corner of the world, we do lose power on a semi-regular basis because we live out in the sticks. And there's been more than one holiday, both Thanksgiving and Christmas, where we've lost power. And that means that some poor sap has to jump in a truck and get in a bucket and brave the elements and try to establish power so that we can play our Xbox games that we got for Christmas. So again, thank you to everybody that is giving up of their time and they're away from their family. Think about military, think about just different civilian areas that people need to make that investment. Just thank you all the way around. So that is great. So anyway, for us then, Christmas is just literally right around the corner. I'm 24 hours out from family descending on the house and just having a good time. So that's going to be great. And so with that though, I wanted to make sure I got a podcast out this week because again, kind of gets a little out of rhythm around this time of year for me. And I'm like, okay, I want to make sure there's one in the can and out there on the interwebs before we go into the holiday season officially. And so this is the one. And again, this is episode 286. And this episode I'm titling, I have it here on my notes, The Trees of Truth versus the Forest of Wisdom. Or maybe a different way to put it is proof texting versus narrative flow. And I know that suddenly sounds a little bit more sophisticated than the initial kind of thing, but here's kind of what I'm thinking about. So I've realized as I've been in my 30 years of pastoral ministry, and I'm always trying to take notes, and I'm noticing the trajectory of my own growth, which to be really honest about the trajectory of my growth, it's very much like the stock market. So my growth is it climbs and it drops and it climbs and it drops and it climbs and it drops. But it's ultimately, I think, climbing in the end, like Matt's 401k. See, too many medicines in my body. But Matt's 401k is growing over the course of a lifetime. But boy, you get any given quarter, any given, budgetary year, you might be like, profit margin was bad that year, right? And that's kind of true, right? And so there's certainly been things in my life where spiritually I have been healthier or I've been more sickly or whatever else, but I look at the overall trajectory and I go, man, what have I learned in that time? How have I hopefully grown in that time? And then what are some things I've just sort of picked up over the course of time that, at least for me, I go, oh, I see this as a unique distinctive, and I think different people are wired in different ways, and I think this is highlighting probably the way that I'm more wired and probably how I've grown. And then as I've thought about that, kind of how I've analyzed that and how I've analyzed that when I compare it to other parties and persons and everything else that I've watched over the course of those 30 years. And so part of this is just kind of observational, right? But when I kind of subtitled today, proof text versus narrative flow, and then I talk about trees and forest, what I've kind of realized is early on in my own Christian walk, I was a proof text guy. What that means is I had 1,000 verses memorized in my head so I could extract those from my mind and plug them into a systematic view of the world and have a proof text for everything. Like there's a verse for this and a verse for this and a verse for this and a verse for this. And so I took the Bible and I just stripped it down to numbers, right? or almost like quick accessed sound bites, and so verses became sound bites. And I just kind of had just this repository of sound bites always in my back pocket to refute an error, to answer a question, to kind of back up a claim, whatever it might be. And yet what I found in some of that is that it had some negative side effects. And so one is I found that I thought I had an answer for everything, because you can probably find a verse that answers most things in life. You can find some nugget. It may not fit the context. It may not have been at all what the author was getting at. The original culture that read it wouldn't have ever thought of that passage that way. But, I kind of thought, like, as long as I have a verse for every answer, then, hey, I'm solid and I'm biblical. Even though maybe I was using the verse in a way that I shouldn't use it, I thought I was fine, right? But also with that, what that developed in me was a pretty strong sense of pride. So I really did think I was smarter than a lot of other Christians. I thought that only those who thought like me were right. And then from that, I thought, because if you're thinking like me, then that makes you a more godly person, because you're thinking like me and I'm like so godly. And we're all finding proof texts or verses to back everything we say. And then that makes us even more biblical than other people. And so from that, I just kind of got anchored in this idea of it was all about the trees. You know what I mean? The more verses that you had in your bag, the more trees of proof texting that you could highlight to make an argument, make a case, build a theology, whatever else, that made you the best Christian on the planet, And I did that for a long time. And then I would say probably about 10 to 12 years into my pastoral life, I had a bit of a crisis of faith. And I've shared that before. And there was really kind of this sense of like, I don't even know if there's a God. And I think part of what that was coming to the end of that trees of truths kind of path. In other words, I had thought that the real power of the Holy Spirit, the real spiritual life, was just in memorizing 1,000 passages and having them at your disposal for every problem in life, and that alone was going to satisfy and was going to, bring me closer to God and make me a better Christian. And, from that, I would just be super, super spiritual. And yet at the end of that journey, what actually happened was I went, sometimes these verses don't always fit together, and sometimes they're saying opposite things of one another. And, I started kind of thinking about it more. And that's not to say that the Bible's contradictory in the most absolute sense, but to say that different writers of the various books of the Bible have different priorities and agendas in what they're writing. And kind of in that, you might say something over here, this writer says something this way, and another writer 500 years down the road says the opposite of that previous writer, because the situation's different, the conditions are different, the problem's different, what they're trying to address is different. And I think as time went on, I began to go, well, wait, if these don't fit together, then this is just a big contradictory book, right? And so pretty soon, all of my memorization of all the separate trees in the wooded plain started to work against one another. And there was probably more things that kind of played into then the kind of the erosion of my faith at the time, where I think it was just like I was seeing what I perceived to be contradictory things, both in the scriptures and in the life of Christians and in the church, And I was definitely connected to Christian environments that were more legalistic in some ways and more we've got all the answers. And so then all the more I'm like, okay, if this is all the answers, we're the most biblical, then why do we not seem to be the most Jesus-like? There's that cold getting me right there. But, it was like, why does this not seem to be connecting all the dots? And so there was a bit of then for me, like, well, maybe the solution is then outside of faith, because I don't see how this whole thing works together. It seems like there's just more pride here. There's more absolutism here. I don't see a lot of Christ-likeness necessarily. I see a lot of moralism. I see a lot of judging both the world and judging a lot of the church at the same time. That doesn't seem to be real life-giving or liberating to me. That doesn't seem like a gospel of grace to me. And so for me, then it kind of led me down this path of disbelief for a while, because I'm like, man, the forest of all these truths do not hold together in the way that I thought they would, and they don't produce the kind of fruit that they thought I should expect in that whole thing. And so there was a season where I kind of walked away. And yet it was in that space that God was able to, kind of get a hold of me in a whole new way, kind of expand my understanding of maybe what his priorities are in some ways. And even in that, to realize the beauty of the diversity of the church, because kind of to that point, I'm like, Catholics are going to hell, Eastern Orthodox are going to hell, main lines are going to hell. It was just, I just thought everybody's going to hell basically. And it was just kind of us fundamentalist evangelical Protestants that were good to go. Maybe there's a couple of people outside of that, but for the most part, no. And I came out the other side with this like deeper appreciation of, wait, the benchmark, and I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but the benchmark of what is true Christianity is literally whose name is in that label. Christianity is Christianity. And so anybody that really looks like Christ, and again, as best as I can understand Christ, is I look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I go, if that is the way that Jesus has been articulated through those four individuals as they either walked with him or did homework and some, kind of eyewitness investigative stuff, what I'm presented with there should be what I would see in people that are most Christ-like, like the truly authentic Christian is going to look like what I see displayed in the gospel accounts. And then that became the new framework for me. Right. And so then I thought about it more and I go, but why was it before when I collected all of these verses in my head and I could just, again, wield them at will to answer every problem and challenge every heresy and really, kind of fabricate and create every theology? Why then, in the end, did I not see more Christ-likeness out of myself or those in that camp that kind of did things in that way? And I realized, at least for me, that there's something about the forest of wisdom that is almost greater times than the trees of the truths of the proof texts that miss probably the trajectory and the arc of the narrative flow. Now, I know that's a lot of fancy stuff, but basically I realized that maybe the power is in the overall unfolding story and the wisdom gleaned from that overall unfolding story, the meta-narrative of God from beginning to end, that what I'm supposed to do is focus on that, not get lost in all of the bits and bytes and data points and memory verses of everything that I can memorize and then wield as a weapon so often, or just wield as a know-it-all kind of device. And instead I realized that all of these are like maybe I'll put it different. It's the difference between having a whole bin of Legos or having something built out of the Legos, right? And I think I was so focused on having the bin of Legos, I didn't think about what are all those Legos designed to build as an overall structure and to let the overall structure be the guiding force of wisdom. And so it was kind of then coming back into my faith, but coming with a slightly different point of view than before. I think in some ways being burned by what I had gone through, burned by what I had done, burned by others that had done it that way too. And I just went like, man, some people are wired for that and they love and thrive in that, but I just didn't find it very Christ-like so often. But then when I came out the other side, I'm like, oh, but when I look at the Bible differently and I get way up over the top of it, then I see this overall story that's unfolding. And I see in that story, I see beauty and I see ugly and I see hate and I see love. And I see people that are wrestling with God and trying to figure it out and failing along the way. And they're humbled in the process, or they fail along the way and they're proud and obstinate in the process. And then from all of that, it was just like, man, I want to gain that kind of wisdom. I want that deeper insight. I don't want to just be the guy that has an answer for everything. In fact, if anything, what I've realized is the more you grow in wisdom, the more you might go, I don't know if I have a very good answer for that. Or I can give you an answer, but it's certainly not some kind of inerrant answer. And I think even in that for me too, what I began to find is that people in other traditions of our Christianity, they too were trying to look at the story in that bigger way. They were getting out of all of the detail things and saying, but what does the big story tell us about God, about us, about the trajectory of where everything is going? And I just found that to be more liberating. And I found that as I looked around, it was the people who wielded wisdom over the people who just wielded a bunch of verses that I went, you just seem softer. You seem more humble. You seem more gracious. You seem more aware of your own sinfulness. Like, I think one of the things I found as a surprise to me as I went through my own process is that before I kind of walked away from my faith, I was smarter than everybody else, and I was more biblical than everybody else. And when I say everybody else, I mean everybody that wasn't a part of my tribe, When I came out the other side, I found that I was almost the opposite. Like, I was like, man, as best as I know, I think this is what's true or right. But I also know that this can be seen 4 other ways. And I want to hold that a little bit more open-handed. On the things that I want to have conviction on, I want to have conviction. On the things that I cannot be positive on, I don't want to be positive on. Because before, I was positive on everything. And I just wasn't... it's almost like you could be straight as an arrow and twice as deadly with the truth. Because when we say the truth, what we mean is the truth as we hold it, the truth as we interpret it, the truth has been taught to us. And I'm not going to say that there isn't truth. What I'm saying, though, is sometimes we equate our understanding of the truth as truth. And the reality is, when I came out the other side, is as best as I can factor in, these are the things I believe to be true. Now, in that, there's some central core Christian things that I go, no Christian debates. So I'm not debating those either, right? So that goes back to kind of the Nicene Creed. That goes back to Jesus is God, Jesus is man. He died for our sins, rose from the dead, born of a virgin, God sent him into... I mean, just those core Christian tenets. But then outside of that, there is a ton of diversity within Christianity, and I think I just found on the other side of that, in the diversity, the people that seem to be the most humble as they hold their diverse ideas also tended to be the most Christ-like figures and people and thinkers. And the ones that don't allow for much diversity in there, they're just all about the trees and not about the forest. I also find that I rarely run across those and I go like, wow, you are so unbelievably Christ-like. Like, I can't deny that just you ooze Jesus in everything you do. Now, I know that sounds terrible because some of you may be, well, Matt, I'm one of those like tree people and I'm not like a forest of wisdom. I'm like the trees of truth people. And I think I'm very Christ-like, and I could be overlooking some things there. And I know that there are certainly people out there that are very trees, trues, and also very much Jesus-like. Now, what I want to say, just as a clarifier, I think all the parties do love Jesus. My question isn't, do people love Jesus? Really, my thing is always like, do they look like him? Do they interact with people like him? Are they attractive to people like Jesus? I'm still always mesmerized that sinful people clamored to be around him. Where religious people, they just decided to fight him. And maybe there's something to that. You know what I mean? I look at how Jesus was radically unconventional, and like in so many of the things that he did, he just broke the molds all the time. He constantly was like challenging Leviticus to do Leviticus. So let me give you an example of this. Leviticus is really clear. You don't touch unclean people. But Jesus actively touched unclean people. So in one sense, Jesus basically violates the Levitical code by touching lepers, touching people who are impure through sexual sin, things of that nature, right? People who were sickly in some way, the woman with the blood flow that touches Jesus even, so Jesus is technically violating Levitical law in those instances. But it's the very book of Leviticus that says, and you are to love your neighbor as yourself. So weirdly, as he transgresses certain Levitical codes, it's for the deeper, greater code, which is the heart of Leviticus, which is to love those very people. And so in this interesting sort of way, I find that's the interesting dynamic of Jesus, right? In other words, he sees the forest of the wisdom of Leviticus, and he's not too concerned about the individual trees of Leviticus, which is why then he kind of does what he does. It would be the same when he gets busted on Sabbath things. To a certain degree, there's some truth that when his disciples are gathering grain on the Sabbath, that it is a Sabbath violation. Or when they are doing things and he links it to David and his men eating the showbread, right? Because that's what happens on this whole debate about the Sabbath. What was technically true is that David violated the law by eating the showbread with his soldiers. Technically, that was a legal violation, but Jesus praises him for it and says, but there's a deeper, more transcendent wisdom that is attached to those things. So we're not talking about, hey, I want to go against some Levitical code or some Deuteronomy code for my own selfishness. No, these were, quote, violations of lesser things to highlight the greater things. So in the case of Jesus and Leviticus, he was highlighting the love of a neighbor. For David to do what he did, he was highlighting his loyalty and love to his soldiers, right? And so I think that's kind of the thing that I've realized more and more is like there is something to be said about not getting so locked into the details, you miss what the details are meant to teach. And that's the wisdom part. Right? That's the overall transcendent thing. I think Paul does the same thing with the law when he's writing his epistles. He's like, you know what? The law served a function to lead us to Christ. But now the Pharisees and religious leaders, they're so locked into the tool, they're missing the purpose of the tool. There was a greater transcendent wisdom to the tool, right? But it's really easy to get so lost into the weeds, into the trees, we miss the forest, we miss the meaning behind all of that, and maybe we become such guardians of the details, we actually lose the heart in the process. And I think that's always kind of the risk of religion. It can lose its core identity, or maybe in some ways it forgets the culture that that's supposed to establish because it's just focused on all of the creedal details and misses the culture, misses the sense of climate that's to be made out of all of those things, right? I mean, this is why I think even Jesus, when he confronts his generation, says, you're the worst of all generations. It's strange because when you go back and look at all of Israel's history, they were, like, you just take the book of Judges, man. They were violent. Eventually, they're idolatrous. They lose sight of God. They go their own way. They engage themselves in all sorts of immorality. And yet, by the time of Jesus getting to the nation, they're no longer doing idols. They're not bringing in the pagan ideologies. They are not getting engaged in sexual promiscuity or any of the things that you would see in the Old Testament. None of that's there. They're actually pretty moral. They really like the Bible. They're doing the right things. They're seeking to be moral. But Jesus says, you're the worst of all generations. The worst of all the generations of Israel. In fact, so bad, this is finally when God's going to close you down because of how bad you are at this point. And when you analyze what was so bad about them, it was, again, they were more moral at that point than any time in all of the Old Testament, but they were so lost into the weeds of the trees, they had missed the forest of the purpose of what God was trying to do with those tools. So the tools became God instead of God being God. The law became their deity instead of Jesus being welcomed as God in human form, as their God, to be their deity, to lead them, guide them, and teach them. This is in part why then when they look at what Jesus teaches, they're so opposed to it. See, Jesus comes and he's embodying the essence of the law. When he says, hey, I came to fulfill the law, what he's talking about is the essence of the law, the heart of the law. I'm giving you the deeper thing of the law, which is why then in the Gospel of Matthew, no sooner does he say, I came to fulfill the law, that he starts upending things for the deeper purpose of the law. I love that whole scene. It's nutty to me. Like, you heard it was said this. Now let me tell you this. You heard it was said that. Now let me tell you that. He's challenging direct Mosaic ideas, right? You heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But now I tell you, turn the other cheek, right? He directly challenges Moses after saying he's come to fulfill the law, but his purpose is to say, because we need a greater, deeper, more thorough law, which is not punch the guy in the face because he punched you in the face, but turn your cheek, right? Because the deeper heart of the law was the love of neighbor, the love of enemy, to coexist in a way that is healthy and wholesome and brings healing to the world, because that was to be Israel's calling. Israel was not to just be like, we're a bunch of rule keepers. No, they were meant to be a bunch of people who demonstrated and embodied difference in a broken world, healing and beauty and kindness in a broken world. And they'd gotten so far away from that that the law almost became an excuse for them to be cruel in the name of God, and that became their problem. And so for that, Jesus is like, and you are the worst generation yet. And that's why the closure's coming. And see, I think this is valuable for us as everyday missionaries for the same reason. It is very easy for us to get focused on the trees of truths more than really strive for the kind of the forest of wisdom. Wisdom's hard. You know, wisdom is complex. I think sometimes it's easier to say, I just want to get into the verses and not see what all of those verses are stacking together as Legos to build a thing. So we miss the kind of the narrative flow. And so with that, what we tend to do is we zero in on rules more than we zero in on kind of ethos. You know, like all of these rules triangulate a thing, but what's that thing? And then how do you filter that through the person of Christ to understand how that's to play out? Because if there's anything I really became a fan of as I've grown over the course of time is realizing that Jesus is the lens by which I should read the Bible. See, for the longest time, I thought, no, you read the Bible just using the exegetical method, culture, language, context, all those kinds of things, which I'm still pro, all of those things, right? You do that homework, you do that thing. What was Moses trying to say to the Israelites back then and Exodus or whatever else? You do that homework, but then we should take that and read that through the lens of the revealed Christ. Like, well, what did we learn about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And how does he inform my understanding then of Exodus in light of him coming, in light of what he's done? See, this is valuable because Jesus said, I am going to send you a teacher and he will guide you into all truth. And that teacher is the Holy Spirit, but he comes from Jesus. So as I'm using Jesus's disposition, Jesus's heart, Jesus's responses to things, and I'm seeking the Holy Spirit to teach me in that process, I can move from just going, do I have nuggets of data points? And I can move into, how does this synthesize as wisdom? How does this really affect and infect in some ways even my world, my perspectives, and from that, it shapes me into a better representative of the person of Jesus. Because at the end of the day, that's who we're wanting to highlight. You know, we're not wanting to highlight Baptists or Methodists or Episcopalians or Lutherans or Protestants, Catholics, whatever your label. Like, we're not here to embody those things. We're here to embody the very otherworldly, upside down and backwards Savior who changes everything. And so that's why we want to strive to read our verses, memorize them. That is fantastic, right? But to realize that they all are meant to give an overall picture that reveals a heart, reveals an ethos, reveals this overwhelming type of culture and climate that is the culture and climate of Christ. And I think the more we can kind of own that we can get out of all of the legality, we can get out of all of the like micro refining details and pull back to go, what is the portrait that is being painted from beginning to end? What are the lessons that I'm learning from the successes and failures of all these characters that are trying to find their way with God and in this world and how to make all of that work? Like, that's the big story. And I think the more we zero in on that, they learn from their mistakes, we learn from their victories, we learn from their shortfall stuff, we learn from the things that they learned as they've shared with us. The more we do that, the more we bring that in and integrate that together, well, then you know the way this goes, the more we will be effective everyday missionaries.